Hello, welcome to this presentation. My name is Don Corleone, and today we're going to talk about the main differences between in-position play and out-of-position play. It's going to be quite a general, heuristics-based session. We're going to talk about not a specific spot, but just the underlying ideas behind playing. Mainly, we'll talk about the difficulties of out of position, but there's definitely some things that people tend to do better actually out of position than in position. We'll talk about that as well. So what are we going to learn today? First of all, we're going to talk about how to stop getting crushed out of position whenever you check. Okay, so this is going to have to do with trapping, protecting checking range, inducing, that sort of thing. I've definitely seen a lot of players struggle with this, and I've had students that come up with very, very funny, almost patch solutions to the problem, like never checking out of position, like barreling the turn 80% out of position, just so they don't get in the spot. So hopefully after this, you'll be more comfortable just checking and letting it happen. Whatever it happens. So another one is river, how to get the most out of your equity. So in position, generally, it's very straightforward how to get the most out of your equity for value. It really is not that complicated. Out of position, though, once you get it, it is not rocket science, but it is definitely a lot more convoluted. And when you look at the sim, it might just seem like a salad of sizings that, or checks or this or that you don't really get. So we'll talk about how to work with that. In that, we're also going to be talking about some of the sizing differences between out of position and in position. It's basically baked into the how to get value topic in both positions, but definitely a difference there. And also, I think these three first ones, some people don't know about them, but they are being hammered a lot in the poker community right now. But this last one, I think, is less hammered. I think people get it less, and we'll talk about it at the end. And I think that's where most people are probably going to find they weren't actually doing the proper strategy. So let's start talking about trapping. So let's compare how trapping works in position and out of position. Okay, so in position, checking brings a new card. Okay, so how does that affect trapping? Well, let's say if you're on the river, it doesn't even make sense to check back with a good hand in position because you just, the hand ends, right? So it doesn't really make sense. But on flop and turn, what happens? That you check back, a new card comes. But that card, let's imagine your button versus big blind single raise spot, and the flop is like Queen 9-5 two-tone, right? And you check back, and it comes a 7, so pretty much a brick, right? Even though it's a brick, you're going to have a set of 7s. You're going to have Queen 7. You're going to have 9-7. You're going to have a bunch of hands, not like an overwhelmingly, not like now you have, I have like all my range is nut combos. No, but you have a couple nut combos that now you hit on that turn. So the fact that a new card comes means that there's not as much need to protect with previous 2-pair and sets and whatnot. There's not as much need for that because some or a lot of the turns, for example, in the case that we're on the flop, a lot of turns are going to add new combos of nutted hands to our range. So there's not as much need for that immediate protection. Another problem with trapping in position is that checking reduces the potential number of bets going into the pot. Okay, so in position, let's say you're on the flop again, you check back. Okay, now if your opponent checks, you can only bet twice. If he bets, you can raise and then bet, which almost amounts to 3 bets, kind of. Out of position, though, it's not as bad, though, because yes, sometimes you check and your opponent checks back, and in that case, you would only have 2 bets left. But if you check, your opponent bets, you can raise, you can barrel turn, and you can barrel river. So that amounts to 4 bets going to the pot, right? So checking out of position doesn't reduce the potential number of bets going to the pot as much. Sometimes it does when your opponent checks back, but sometimes it increases the potential growth of the pot if your opponent reopens the action. So that's a difference, which makes checking out of position with good hands definitely a more of a thing. And then out of position, checking doesn't immediately realize equity. You don't bring a new card. You don't change anything on the board. You don't get to showdown. Nothing really happens besides that you show your opponent that you checked, right? And you give him the opportunity to do whatever he wants. So the way that changes, the strategy is that now we have a bunch of middling strength hands that are not at all protected unless we check with very strong hands on that particular street. There's no turn card that can help us protect our range. There's no extra thing. It's just like what it is. Like our range is our range, and it's completely up to our opponent to know what to do against it. Okay, so this is why out of position, trapping is a lot more important with strong hands. So we're going to look at an example. So blind versus blind, queen 9-5 rainbow. It's going to be a c-bet on flop, call, and then we're going to get to a turn and see how both players approach that scenario. We're going to look at 2 pair plus, we're going to look at top pairs. In general, we're going to look at how value is approaching the situation. So here we are. Again, c-bet flop, call. Now we're on the turn. And let's look actually first, let's start by in position. See the small blind checks, and now we're the big blind in position. Let's look at the strategy with value mainly. And as we can see right here, it seems to be actually pretty straightforward, right? This bluffs a lot. This bluffs a little bit less. This bluffs a little bit less. This doesn't bet at all. It just checks to realize equity. This starts betting more and more. Up until 2 pair plus, it just always bets. Okay, I mean, that's very straightforward, right? Like if I told you, how are you supposed to play poker? If I told that to a new player that has just played a few thousand hands, he would be able probably to tell me, okay, so with weak hands, we bluff. With strong hands, we bet for value. And with middling hands, we try to control the size of the pot, right? So let's look now at the out of position game, which is going to be a lot more convoluted, okay? And we see that immediately this graph looks all janky and weird, right? There is some pattern, clearly, like these hands still check, these hands still bluff, and weaker hands bluff, or weaker showdown value hands bluff more than stronger showdown value hands. But then there's like a point here where it checks less, and then it starts checking more. Okay, and these are the traps that we were talking about. So let's look at 2-person sets. And these are, once again, what we would consider the traps of the range. And as you can see, they are pretty much checking half of the time. Okay. Why are they checking so much? Well, the reason why they are checking so much is because we have to slow down a lot on this turn. Okay, we can only barrel about 37% of the time on this turn. Okay? And so we have a very, very large checking range, and we need to protect it with a large amount of nut hands. Okay, so that's why almost half of the nutted hands are checking here. Now, yes, there's some combo selection, like for example, Queen 4 is mostly betting. Well, because it's probably because it's unblocking the 9 and the 5, but it's blocking the Queen. So we're going to get called a lot, but we're not going to face turn bets as often. So it prefers to just bet. Whereas 9-5, it does the exact opposite. Our opponent is more likely to have a Queen that will bet, but he's much less likely to have a 9 and a 5 that will call a turn bet. So it's almost, these two hands do the exact opposite thing, because they have the exact opposite blocker effects. It makes kind of sense. But in reality, I mean, most of these hands, regardless of blocker effects, are just kind of betting or checking at some frequency. If you don't want to be as exact, right? So very important. And what's the issue if we were not to do this? Okay, what would happen if we decided that we're just going to play as if we were playing in position? I have a set of nines. I'm just going to bet the turn because why not? What's the worst that can happen, right? Well, the worst that can happen is, let's say your opponent is a very smart opponent. He has, let's say, data on you. Let's say he is using a HUD. Let's say he's using population reads. Let's say he's using certain data points to be able to tell that your checks are unprotected. Okay. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that, first of all, you're probably going to overfold to the bet. Because if you fold all of these hands, which are good folds, but then you don't have this hand, you don't have this hand, you don't have this hand, right? If you don't have a lot of those hands that are pure check raises or check calls, then of course you're just going to be calling a smaller percentage of your range, right? So the first thing that's the problem that you're going to have is you're probably going to start overfolding. You don't do that. Another problem is that you're going to be under check raising, right? You're not going to have enough check raises. You're not going to have enough check calls. And what happens when we do that? Well, our opponent could, first of all, bluff a lot, right? He could just bluff like an absolute monkey. And he could both bluff and value bet extremely thin and extremely big. Because if we don't have a set of nines in our range, what's stopping him from just overbet with queen six on turn and river? Nothing's stopping him. He's not going to run into a better hand, right? So he is able to take extremely aggressive and thin lines with value and extremely aggressive lines with bluffs, right? Now, let's say you might think, okay, but this is easy. Let me just check with a capped range. I'm not going to check strong hands. I'm just going to check, some second pair. I'm just going to check all second pair, but then I'm going to always call the turn and always call the river, right? That way, I'm not going to be exploitable, right? Like, I just check. I have a capped range, but then I don't fold, so who cares? Our opponent cannot exploit us. Well, that's not true. He can actually exploit us very hard if we do that, because he could just, let's say we check none of these hands, for example. Let's say we don't check any of these hands. Let's in fact say we don't even check any of these top pairs. We just bet with queen 10 or queen jack plus, and we never check, right? So we're completely capped past queen jack, for example, right? So we don't check any of those. Well, our opponent could now take a hand like queen 8 and just overbet the turn 3-4 times the pot and shove the river. And if we station, like we said, we're still going to get very exploited, right? Because our opponent now can go thinner for value. So basically, there's no way to fix our issues after we check a capped range. Checking a capped range and the stationing doesn't work against a very smart opponent, because the very smart opponent is going to be able to also value bet extremely thin if needed. Right? So the only way to stop that from happening is to do those traps, okay? Included with some of these overpairs, top pairs. Some of these are done for, to some extent, board coverage, and also to be a little bit elastic versus sizings. Like, the solver will try to have certain traps that are a trap if your opponent bets small, but if your opponent bets very big, you can fold them. Like, that's something that the solver will try to do. Just have traps that are a trap against a certain sizing, but not against another. Just to be flexible and elastic versus different sizings. But the point is the same. You're trying to stop your opponent from both value betting extremely big, extremely thin, and to bluff you very frequently by trapping those hands. So, when is this most important to do in practice? Well, The first spot where it would be the most important to do in practice is if your opponent is such that he would bet very thin and very big for value, right? If you have opponents that would take, if you check to them here, they would just take a top pair, deuce kicker, and just overbet, which some people do, then you definitely want to check nines. You definitely want to check fives. Not even mix, not even RNG. In that particular scenario, you would want to just check always because you are facing too much aggression. If we go to this node, see these bets right here and these frequencies and sizings, this is the exact amount of aggression that makes our set of nines indifferent between betting and checking. The reason nines is indifferent between betting and checking is that we are facing this exact amount of aggression. If we're facing more aggression, then checking becomes better. If we're facing less aggression, then betting becomes better, right? It's really not that difficult. So against that type of opponent, it would be the most important to have those traps in your range. Let's say now you're facing a different type of opponent. Let's say now your opponent is more passive. He's just going to take queen 7, queen 6, queen 8, and he's just going to check it back, and then maybe on river he's going to go for like a half part, a 3/4 bet. Just try like some small value, but see if you can call with a weak ass hand. That passive player that's not greedy with value, that's not very bluffy, against that guy, generally, you do not want to do this. You do not want to check a set of nines. Okay? So the problem that I see in people is, I see different types of problems. So one problem that I see in people is them not understanding how to construct the range GTO-wise, right? Like, and then just playing a very face-up and then not knowing how to adjust later, just losing a bunch of EV along the way. And the other problem that I see is people who stick to GTO in a very brain-dead way, just like RNG 50-50 with nines and move on. Well, I mean, that's not terrible, but what if your opponent is just a passive Fitch? Why would you do that? That's terrible. That's not a very good idea, right? Like, if one play is indifferent in the solver, there's going to be many spots where in real life it's not at all indifferent. Okay, and that's actually where most of your win rate is going to come in poker. It's not from copying the solver or coming up with like the best sizing scheme and all that. The people who win the most are the ones that are able to gauge correctly what play is better, even if they are really close. Even if two plays seem really close, the player who is able to tell which one is better in this particular pool, at this particular stakes, against this particular opponent, in this particular flop, turn, etc., that's where most of the EV is. Okay, so definitely learn how to play the proper GTO strategy and then learn how to adjust it. Right? That's really where the money is at. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Structuring value on the river. Okay. In position, once again, it's very straightforward. Okay. Similarly to out of position, it's actually even more straightforward on the river to play in position than on the turn. In position, if you have enough equity to get called mostly by worse hands, you value bet. Let me kind of repeat that. If you have a hand with enough equity that when you bet, you get called mostly by worse, you value bet. Okay, that's it. But there's a limit to that because you don't size down infinitely, as there is inherent value in checking and closing action. So you can't say, okay, my hand has 51% equity, so I'm going to bet 1% of the pot. I'm just going to bet one big blind in this 100 big blind pot, just so I get called by 99% of his range, and I just come out ahead slightly after getting called. No, that's not how it works, okay? You can't size down infinitely, as there is inherent value in checking and closing action. When you bet in position, you reopen the action, and you allow your opponent to polarize, raise for value, raise as a bluff, and that reduces the EV of your thin value hands. So your thin value hands don't want the action to be reopened. Okay, so there's inherent value in just not betting 1/3 of the pot in position, not betting a quart pot, not betting like one of those sizings, right? Out of position, though, that's not the case. There's basically no way to close action, whether you bet or you check, unless the SPR is so small that you can show up. That's a way to end the action. But whether you bet or you check, your opponent can reopen by raising or by betting in case you check. Okay. So there's no inherent value in checking, and therefore there's no limit in most spots to how small you can go. So very commonly you'll find, quarter pot bets, third pot bets, fifth pot bets. And in some scenarios, a bit more specific scenarios, you'll even find 10% of the pot bets, like really, really tiny bets. Okay. For this reason, you also can and should check some strong hands. So because checking doesn't close the action, checking doesn't close the action. And so traps, once again, kind of goes back to the previous slides, traps make more sense out of position on the river than in position, because in position they make no sense at all, as you can imagine. So let's look at a river example, and let's try to, pinpoint the differences between the strategies. We'll look at different equity thresholds for value betting, and we'll look at different sizings that either position is using. Okay. So once again, let me first go to the in position player. This is a spot, big blind versus button, single raise spot, where big blind checks, button bets 1/3, big blind calls. Turn goes check, check. A very common scenario where you call a c-bet, turn goes check, check. But first, let's look at in position strategy. Look at this. Pretty straightforward, right? Value bets, bluffs. Showdown value checks. That's it. That's really like not that complicated to understand, right? So you see the weakest hands, depending on the amount of air that you have, the amount of value that you have, you're gonna have to pick a certain frequency for bluffing. Then you're gonna check a bunch of hands that don't have any value, and then once you get to a certain point, you're gonna start value betting. Right? It happens to be whenever you have a hand that's queen 10 or stronger, you can and should value bet. And whenever you have a hand that's, in this case, queen 10 or weaker, you mostly and definitely past 10-9, pure check for showdown value. Right? So very, very, very intuitive. The only caveat is that when you're splitting a couple different sizings, like in this case, you're betting 2/3, roughly 60%, and a small overbet, the difference is going to be the fact that you're going to need to have some traps, but not traps in the sense of checks, but traps in the sense of kind of sneaky small bets. Why are these traps? Well, because you're kind of fishing for a race. When you bet 60% with fives, sure, getting called is like whatever, but what you really, really want is to get raised. Okay. As I was saying, yes. So fives, betting with fives, definitely, not the worst to get called, but what you really, really want is to get raised. So there's still some nuance to how to play very, very strong hands in terms of sizing, but the betting or checking itself is completely intuitive, right? Now let's go to out of position, and remember this graph right here and this kind of like shape. Now let's go to out of position. Okay, so it became a bit of a mess, right? Now there's of course some resemblance, like for example, the fact that bluffs are very bad hands and the pure checks are very middling hands, right? I mean, that's still the same, right? But then all of this value is very strange because for some reason, second pair is betting mostly, but a set is mostly checking, and two pair is mostly checking. How's that possible, right? Like, okay, we have to protect our checking range. Why not protect it with a second pair? Why do we protect our checking range with a set and not a second pair? Right? Well, the reason is because a second pair does not protect our checking range. If we check with a second pair, our opponent can still take a top pair or a bluff and overbet 5 times the pot. And we're screwed, right? To protect our checking range, we don't do it with bluff catchers. We do it with traps, with hands that are actually beating his value bets, okay? So let's go kind of like step by step. So let's go to second pair. And we see these hands right here that are basically, I mean, 10-9 is checking a little bit, but especially these two are really just pure checking, right? Pure block betting, pretty much. Pure betting at least, okay? Why is that? And why do these hands pure check? Okay, so let's look at equity. It just happens to be that around 69% equity is going to be the threshold for value betting, right? And then 65 or lower, it just has to pure check. So these hands right here and anything weaker, pure check, because of course, they are not stronger or strong enough to value bet. But this is a principle out of position. The thinnest parts of your value bet range are usually always betting. The thinnest portion of your value betting range is pretty much always betting. Why? Well, look at the size. Okay, we're betting about a quarter pot because that's the most comfortable way to go for value with a hand like Jack 10 or Queen 10. That's the most comfortable sizing that we can end up in with those hands, right? The problem with which if we check is that one of two things are going to happen if we check. Either our opponent is going to check back, and therefore we lose some potential EV because these hands deserve a little bit more than that. These couple hands deserve a bigger pot than a check down pot. They deserve a little bit more. So if it goes check, check, those hands lose a little bit of EV. If our opponent bets, as you can see, the average sizing is going to be somewhere in the realm of 90%, 80% pot. Okay? And in that case, these hands also lose EV because versus those bets, these are just zero EV bluff catchers. Well, probably not. Probably they are calls, but they are low EV calls. They lose EV in that line because the pot is too uncomfortable, too big for these hands. Okay, so the only way to get to this specific size of the pot is to lead small. So very commonly out of position, there's some thin portion of the value range that is a pure block. Okay, just a pure value bet for small sizing. Once you get to a hand like ace 10, in this case, it starts checking a lot. Why? For two reasons. One reason is because now ace 10 is strong enough. Now our opponent is value betting ace 10, queen 10, some 10-9, and therefore ace 10 now can check call for a lot of EV. When we check call with ace 10, our hand is going to be worth about 5 big blinds, right? So it's a very strong, it's almost just a trap at that point with ace 10, right? So there's this funny thing out of position where to take a passive action, sometimes you need to have actually a stronger hand, right? To take the most passive action, which is the check, you need to have ace 10 and not queen 10 because ace 10 is strong and queen 10 is weak, right? That's kind of a funny thing out of position. So then we get to top pair and we see some checks here. Why? Well, because these hands, top pair, 8 kicker towards 6 kicker, it happens to be a type of hand that is comfortable both leading a big sizing or check calling against a big sizing. Like both lines are very satisfactory for this hand, right? Then you get to king 9, and now check calling starts being a little bit too small of a pot. So now you start just pure leading for value. These hands now start blocking. Overbet or block. Now, what happens with these hands is check raising is too much. Check calling is too small. Overbetting is just the perfect sizing. And small betting to get raised and then call the raise is a trap at that point. Small bet here is a trap. So once again, why do these hands barely bet small at all, but these hands bet small much more? Because these are strong enough to trap in the bet small sizing. Okay, so once again, so this like little funny way of structuring the value range. And then once we get to 2 pair plus, kind of everything goes. Some hands check, some hands bet big, some hands bet small. It will mainly have to do with blockers. So for example, 5s is blocking 5x checkbacks on the river. And so 5s is good for trapping in the check line. Whereas a hand like King 10 is unblocking all of the checkbacks. It's unblocking the ace high, it's unblocking the 3, the 4, the 5. So you really do not want to check that hand. Right? So it's based on blockers, but the idea is these are strong enough to trap. And once again, what would happen if we don't do that? What happens if we don't structure our range like this and we structure it the same way in position did? So we just bet very often with these hands and less often with these hands. That's not going to work because then our opponent can't just bet very big with good hands and with bluffs, right? And we want to avoid that. We want to stop our opponent from being able to apply infinite pressure in order for our middling hands to get to showdown. Our strategy is built around the idea that our middling hands have to be able to reach showdown decently often. And if we have very capped ranges, our opponents are going to get very aggressive and we're just not going to get to showdown and win. Okay. All right. So after that whole explanation, let's look at bluffing on the turn. And some of these previous topics, some people are unfamiliar with, some people are familiar with. I feel like this topic, most people do wrong, honestly, even at high stakes, probably. Not everyone, but a lot of people still do it wrong. Okay. So what are the differences about bluffing on the turn? It does apply to the flop as well, but it applies mostly to the turn, to some extent to the flop. In position, when we bet, we get folds comparable to MDF, meaning bluffing with just about anything is going to be roughly 0 EV, sometimes positive EV, because our opponent is going to fold enough that our risk to reward ratio is going to be good enough to bet. Okay. We realize some equity by checking back. Okay, whether we're on the flop or the turn, when we check back, a card comes, we get closer to showdown, and we just see if we hit our draw or not, or if we hit our 2 pair or not, right? We realize some equity by checking back. Our draws will mix it up in position, and our air will bet with good enough characteristics. So why? Well, because we are getting folds comparable to MDF, meaning we can bet with air as long as it has good enough characteristics, right? If we have on blockers or if we have like decent blockers with the air, we're getting enough folds so we can bluff. Okay. And with draws, yes, we can bet and inflate the pot, which is good in case we hit our draw. But also, if we check back, we avoid, for example, getting raised. We avoid getting raised. We realize our pair outs. We just realize a lot of our robust and non-robust equity by checking back. Okay. And so our draws will mix it up and our air will mix it up. Both types of hands will mix it up to some extent. Out of position, though, it's not like that. Out of position, it's actually more intuitive. It's more, kind of how people naturally play. What happens out of position is that when you bet the turn out of position, to some extent the flop, you don't usually get enough folds comparable to MDF, meaning the risk to reward ratio for betting the turn actually doesn't allow you to just bet anything. You don't get enough folds to bet anything for that risk and reward ratio. Okay. Especially on drawy boards. When there's a lot of flush draws, the main position is going to float extremely wide. Okay. We don't realize as much equity by checking. Okay. When you have a flush draw, if you check out of position, now what? Like you're going to face a bet. What do you do? You're going to check raise. You're going to so definitely the EV of the checks with a lot of draws becomes worse because you don't see the next street. You actually can just face a bet right then and there. Okay. Our draws will mostly fast play down to a certain threshold of draws that are too weak for the amount of folds we get. So we said we don't really get a lot of folds. Therefore, to bet, we need some extra equity, right? So what we will do is generally fast play with draws, bet with that threshold of equity very often. And when it's below that amount of equity, we usually just check and give up, basically. Okay. Air will generally not bet, especially on drawy boards. So there are spots where air will bet, and these spots are either where the board is so extremely dry that even air has a lot of equity, or spots where you have such a big advantage that your opponent is actually going to fold a lot. Okay. So let's try a quiz, see how you guys understand this spot. Let me first kind of frame the question because it might be a little bit confusing. So we're blind versus blind, and the flop is queen 7-5, two-tone. Okay, blind versus blind, we're the small blind, and the flop is queen 7-5, two-tone. We see bet small, we get called, and the turn is a 2 of the other suit. So there's a double flush draw on the turn. Okay, let's say, for example, the flop is queen 7 of hearts, 5 of diamonds. We see bet small, get called, 2 of diamonds on the turn. Okay, so double flush draw, very drawy turn after c-betting the flop, blind versus blind. Okay, now let's imagine we have a hand like 10-8 with the double flush draw blocker. So in this case, we said queen 7 of hearts, 5-2 of diamonds. Let's say we have the 10 of hearts and the 8 of diamonds, or the 10 of diamonds and the 8 of hearts. Okay, the double flush draw blocker. How often does 10-8 offsuit with the double flush draw blocker bet the turn? Always, sometimes, or never? Some people say always. It's a very polar answer. People feel really strongly about this. No one is like, sometimes. The answer is never. 10-8 with the double flush draw blocker does not bet the turn. Now, if the positions were reversed, if this was bottom versus big blind, single raise spot, and the flop goes check, c-bet, call, then the turn is probably going to bet at a very high frequency. So let's actually do that. Let's just go to this particular example, but let's actually start with the bottom versus big blind. Let's actually start with the bottom versus big blind scenario. So c-bet small, call, and then the turn was like the 2 of diamonds. And 10-8, I mean, some of these combos are betting at least sometimes, right? Like, at least we can say, okay, 9-8 of, well, that's to some extent a draw. But you have like queen 9 with the double blocker with no draw, even just with one flush blocker. So yeah, so in position, it is sometimes. As we said, in position players need to bet some of these hands some of the time because the amount of folds you get is relatively satisfactory. It's relatively satisfactory. So we bet 3/4 spot, we're getting 42.4% folds. Right? So it's a satisfactory enough fold amount that we are able to bet with these hands. Right? And our bluffing range is composed of some no draw, obviously not as much as other types of hands, but some no draw type hands, then some gut shots, some open-enders, flush draws, not flush draws, combo draws. But as you can see, almost everything mixes it up. Almost everything mixes it up. Why? Air can bet because of what we said, okay? Air can bet because it gets a satisfactory amount of folds. Flush draws and such can check because for a couple reasons. Because checking realizes our pair outs, and because betting is subjected to being to getting raised, which is not great with some of these flush draws. Okay, with some of these flush draws, getting checked is not that great. So, but when we go to the opposite positions, let's say blind versus blind, I actually have the board here. There you go. We see that it's basically none of these hands are really betting besides hands with an overcard. Okay, and this, now what happens? Well, now these hands start having some equity. They're drawing to top pair. If you bet half pot on the turn or 3/4 and you hit a king on the river, king of spades, you can value bet again. Okay, it's actually reasonable amount of equity to have one overcard with the flush draw blockers. But hands with basically no equity are just doomed. Okay? There's no way for you to gain EV by betting. You just have to check, place a bet, and you fold. Okay? Why? Well, now if we see what happens when we bet 75% of the pot, we get less folds. It's not that significant, but it is less folds. And actually, for a 75% pot size bet, the risk to reward ratio for this amount of folds is not satisfactory enough. Okay? It's not satisfactory enough. So that's why we give up. So out of position, the way we're going to construct our bluffing range is we start with, for example, let's say weak ace high in terms of showdown value. We need to start from two sides. We need to look at equity and showdown value. So we're going to start looking at, for example, ace high, even potentially some pairs, but mostly ace high, low ace high, not ace high. High ace high is not weak enough to bluff generally in this particular scenario. But we start with low ace high in terms of showdown value down to nothing. And then we can look at different parts of the equity range. So combo draw, betting extremely often. Ace high betting less because of showdown value, because of certain variables there. Nut flush draws are checking a lot because of the ace high. It's not because they are the nut flush draw, it's because they have ace high and they want to check to realize their pair outs. And then when we get to weaker flush draws, open-enders and gut shots, we see an overwhelmingly high amount of bets compared to how it was in position, okay, for the reasons aforementioned. Okay, in position, the bluffing range is constructed basically around everything. So you take all of the hands and you bet with air a little bit when you have really good blockers. Then you bet with draws a little bit more, stronger draws a little bit more, stronger draws a little bit more. Out of position, it's like really, really black or white. Like, do you have enough equity? Okay, you can bet sometimes. Do you have even more equity? Okay, you can bet very, 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 very often. Do you have enough equity? No. Then you just have to check fold. Okay, that's the difference, especially on wet boards. Now, there is a caveat to this. For example, a board like, let's say, King 2-2-8 rainbow. Okay, and we said that out of position needs to bluff with equity. Okay, what is equity here, right? Like you need this caveat when you apply this idea, which is like on some board, equity might be a flush draw or open ender, but on this turn, equity is going to be a weak ace high, just one overcard, or even a hand like Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 9, because those are at least two overcards to the 8, right? I mean, yeah, 2 overcards to the 8, that's really trashy draw, but it's better than nothing, right? It's better than Jack 4. So we're going to see a bluffing range composed of equity, but how much equity is relative to the board. More wet boards, we need more equity, or less wet boards, we need less equity. And we will also see probably reflected in the amount of calls we get. Here, when we bet, we get a much more satisfactory amount of folds, which is also why we're able to bet with some of those hands. So we'll see ace high. Well, that's more so value, to be honest. But when we go to no mate hand, really, like, these hands are the most important candidates for betting. Why? Because they have 2 overcards to the 8, right? That's just what it is. And then these hands are still, like, slightly profitable to, or at least reasonably played as bets. Right? So there's a caveat to, like, how dry the board is, how wet the board is. So Rafe says we have loads of high equity flushers to bet instead, and we don't have much showdown EV when hitting the pair outs, as we may face a river red. I don't, like, that's true, but I don't think that's a sufficient answer, because that would mean in position would do the same. Like, that, what you said right there, could apply very easily to the in position player. The reason is that out of position, that is true, and also checking with the draw isn't great, and betting with air doesn't get a satisfactory amount of folds. Whereas in position, checking with the draw is very good, and betting with air does get a satisfactory amount of folds. All right. Adam says, because the node EV is favorable, so out of position, the node is unfavorable. Sure, but the real, like, tangible answer is really, like, you get called more. If you're out of position and you bet, you're going to get called more than if you're in position and you bet. Okay? All right. So let's summarize some of the things we talked about. Out of position needs to drop more than in position. Okay? That seems very, very intuitive. Out of position needs to develop smaller sizings and bet thinner for value. Okay? Because of this non-realization of the checking range. Right? The checking line is worse out of position, so you prefer to bet a little bit thinner and smaller. Out of position on earlier streets, equity is the main characteristic for bluffing, whereas in position, blockers and unblockers and cleansing effects play a bigger role. Okay, do you block the flush draw? Do you not block the flush draw? Are you going to fold out better air? Are you going to fold worse air? Those kinds of things. So, if you got any questions, now's the time to ask. And for everyone watching the recording, thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye, guys.